Are you ready, kids?
Hey guys, Pieguyrulz here, and welcome to every episode of SpongeBob Season 6 Reviewed. We have 44 11-minute episodes, 2 22-minute specials, and 1 TV movie to get through. Before working on this review, I've seen maybe 1/6 of this entire season. Though I gave up on watching the show religiously around the time of Spongehenge, I did watch a few of these episodes in the beginning of the season because I don't even know why. Maybe morbid curiosity, maybe just out of a pattern of watching the show, or maybe I just happen to randomly catch these things on TV without intending to watch them. But to be honest, the ones that I have seen, I've only seen once, and I hardly remember them anyway, so this season is almost entirely fresh. As with last time, I'll give you the disclaimers. There's gonna be spoilers here, although unlike most shows, spoilers in SpongeBob aren't that big a deal. And also, if you haven't checked them out yet, I highly suggest you watch my Square Theory videos. I discuss a few topics that I might briefly mention here, and if you're curious as to my full opinion, these are the videos you really want to check out. Also, keep in mind I have a series called Spongy Bits where I do extended reviews on stuff I've already reviewed in this series. So if there's any review here that you think I could elaborate on a little bit more, feel free to leave a comment suggesting I revisit that episode, and I probably will. Alright, let's dive into the first episode. Episode 101A, House Fancy. When Squilliam is featured on a TV show about fancy houses, Squidward gets jealous and tries to prove that his house is fancier. My favorite part of the episode is the background art and design of Squilliam's house. I think it's very creative and visually interesting, and it needed to be considering it was the focus of the first half of the episode. Alton Brown guest stars as the host of House Fancy in this episode, which to me is an epic fail. I mean, I guess I shouldn't expect much more from the people that cast David Bowie to not sing, but seriously, you have a show where the protagonist cooks food. Why isn't Alton Brown in an episode related to the Krusty Krab? For those of you who don't know, he's both part entertainer and part chef. He would have been perfect for an episode about the Krusty Krab's cooking, though he does give a great performance here. I almost didn't recognize him because he is acting, he's not just doing his regular voice. The thing about this episode is that it does a lot of things right, and it does a lot of things wrong. I always appreciate when they do episodes from Squidward's perspective because it definitely changes things up. And the fact that it uses some CG, the fact that it has a guest star, the fact that it focuses a lot on Squilliam's house and just the design of it, makes it feel like a very different episode. And I think that's one of the best things I can say about it, is that it is definitely different, both in structure and in tone. It is visually interesting, and I am invested in Squidward's story. I want things to turn out alright for him. And surprisingly enough, they actually do, which is enough to make it a very different episode. Squidward wins in the end, and he beats Squilliam. So for those of you keeping track at home, that's Squidward 2, Squilliam 1. And SpongeBob isn't super creepy in this episode either. Yeah, he's a little bit into the stalker territory with waiting outside of Squid's window, but at least he doesn't go overboard with it. I mean, this time he is actually outside of Squidward's house, and I see it more as a means to get SpongeBob involved in the plot than to just have him irritate Squidward. And all of his little blunders do actually genuinely seem like accidents instead of some kind of weird targeted violence towards Squidward. Let's talk about the downsides though. The episode really isn't funny by any stretch of the imagination, and though the plot is interesting, the subject matter itself isn't incredibly compelling. It's about a home decorating show. That's not exactly something that's very universally watched amongst kids, though I'm sure their parents would appreciate it. There's also a lot of little things, like the fact that Squidward's toilet comes to life after Patrick does his business in it. That kind of joke feels a lot more at home in Rocko's Modern Life. There's a way to skirt the line between anthropomorphic and non-anthropomorphic, and I think they went a little bit too far with making the toilet anthropomorphic here. And let me just state right now, the toenail scene only came into effect a tiny bit when deciding to give a ranking to this episode. Because let's be fair, it's only 10 seconds long. And yes, it's a painful 10 seconds. Nothing about it is funny, and it does make me cringe. It's thoroughly unenjoyable, but it's over fast. So I think it's pretty obvious that I'm gonna call this episode meh. It's a weird mixture of being both very interesting and yet very dull. When you get right down to it, not much actually happens in the episode. The first half is looking at Squilliam's house, second half is Squidward trying to clean up his house. And while the stuff with Squilliam and the host is a little bit different from what you'd expect from a SpongeBob episode, the stuff where SpongeBob is trying to clean up Squidward's house is exactly what you'd expect from SpongeBob. We've seen SpongeBob painting before, and we've seen SpongeBob accidentally screwing up Squid's house. though at the end of the day, they decided to do something a little bit different with the structure, which I always approve of, even if it didn't work out so well. Episode 101B, Krabby Road. Plankton forms a rock band to try and extract the secret formula from SpongeBob. My favorite part of the episode is when SpongeBob finds out that the name of the band is Plankton and the Patty Stealers, and he sits there and he's like, They hold on it just long enough to fool me into thinking maybe SpongeBob will actually catch on. But no, he doesn't. Which is quite clever, because usually the joke is that he wouldn't catch on, and that's the joke that they go with. But because they hold on it for so long, they actually fool me into thinking maybe they won't go with that joke. Maybe SpongeBob will actually figure it out. Plankton is seen playing the keyboard here, and Patrick plays the belly drum. Both versions of the instruments they play in Band Geeks, which is a nice little touch. In fact, there's a lot of nice little touches here, like the fact that Plankton actually begins the episode in jail. I don't think I've ever seen Plankton actually in jail, so it's very different to start the episode with it. There's also a little continuity nod to Fun, where in Fun he says he's never had a good time, and in this episode he also says he'd never had a good time. Of course that refutes friend or foe, so yeah. I also like the fact that Plankton keeps his greasy mustache hair thing throughout the entire episode. They don't abandon it after the first scene. I also like how there's a little joke towards the beginning where Patrick says he found out where boogers come from, when towards the end of the episode, SpongeBob stuffs Plankton up his nose and Plankton becomes a booger. That part is hilarious, and the fact that they actually foreshadowed that joke makes it even better. And it's always nice to see Squidward have a little bit of success. The episode's not all good things, though. There's one problem that will persist throughout Season 6, and I'll go into more detail at the very end, but the animation in this season is the worst it's ever been. Take note of when Patrick is first doing his belly drum thing. There's a point at which it loops, and it is very obvious. There are frames missing from the loop, so Patrick just jumps in space from one frame to the next. I get that they wanted to loop him doing the belly drum, but if the first frame doesn't match up to the last frame, then the looping will not look good, and it doesn't. But a few seconds of bad animation does not falter what is otherwise a really awesome episode. It's good. There's a lot of good jokes, it's an interesting twist on the Plankton stealing the formula episode, and there's a lot of nice little things in the middle. Episode 102A, Penny Foolish. After seeing SpongeBob find a penny, Mr. Krabs becomes obsessed with getting it from him. My favorite part of this episode is just the general premise. I like the idea that Mr. Krabs has to try to basically scam SpongeBob out of his penny. And I especially like the fact that it is a penny. It is something so trivial and stupid that Mr. Krabs is obviously wasting money and effort in trying to get something so small. Unfortunately, though, the execution is very, very botched. Starting with the fact that we literally see a scene twice, with no variation or anything until the end of the scene. We see SpongeBob pick up what is a brown-looking object, by the way, we'll get to that in a second. And then he has a fantasy sequence of the exact same event. The only joke is that at the end, SpongeBob starts talking like the cashier. At first, I did a double take because I couldn't believe that they would literally just show the same scene twice back to back. They don't even space it out. At first, I thought, wait, maybe there's something clever in here. Maybe the first time Mr. Krabs sees it, it's green, because in reality, what SpongeBob picks up actually is green, and then when he remembers it as a penny. That would have actually been clever and foreshadowing of the twist. But no, they didn't do that. They didn't do anything else with it either, like, I don't know, putting a mustache on SpongeBob, or just doing a joke about how Mr. Krabs is so old he's not remembering things right. But no, it's just the same uninteresting scene twice. The ending is dumb as well. It would have made a lot more sense if it had been like a bottle cap or something. I get that they wanted to do this stupid joke where it turns out to be something really valuable in the end, but it's not brown. You literally lied to your audience twice just to pull a really stupid ending gag. Another issue with this plot is that it's pretty clear to the audience that SpongeBob doesn't have the penny. SpongeBob is not the type of person that would hide the penny from Mr. Krabs. I get that he's going overboard and insane and obsessive, but it's frustrating to the audience because it's blatantly obvious Mr. Krabs is barking up the wrong tree. Especially if you've seen this episode before. Oh, and in the ending, we have an actual sweet moment where Mr. Krabs realizes his mistake and apologizes to SpongeBob, only to go right back to digging. I get that they're trying to tell a joke here, but really, when you write this sort of thing, you have to think, is it a funny enough joke to ruin what could have actually been a sweet moment? In my opinion, no, it wasn't. There's also a really weird part where SpongeBob's brain falls out of his head, and SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs have to go chase it around the restaurant. What usually is a quick gag of SpongeBob's brain falling out turned into this long chase sequence for really no reason at all. It's not funny, a little bit gross, and a big waste of time. Though I will say, I really do like Mr. Krabs' reaction to all of it. If the scene had been a little bit shorter, then I think it would have all been worth it for Mr. Krabs' reaction of just, okay then. I do also like the scene where Mr. Krabs sees everything turning into pennies. I thought that was well handled. And I like how deadpan Squidward is in this episode. He just has no emotion other than, I don't want to be here. There are also some little things that kind of made me chuckle, like when a random townsfish called Mr. Krabs fat, or how every time the townspeople see Mr. Krabs, he's squeaking like a dolphin and making ridiculous gestures to show just how much of a fool he's making himself look like. Overall, there's a lot of problems, and this episode isn't memorable in the least. So, I'm gonna call it a
ScumBob
episode. Episode 102B, Nautical Novice. SpongeBob tries to impress Mrs. Puff by memorizing the history of boating. My favorite part? The hearty seaman's laugh. Ha ha ha! In general, I really like this plot and this episode. It was amusing and pleasant to see SpongeBob be actually knowledgeable about boating. And the action scene towards the end is actually quite intense and awesome. There's not really a lot of good jokes in this episode, but there's a lot of little ones and a lot of nice little touches, like how SpongeBob thinks he can read all of the book and still get 8 hours of sleep before boating school the next day. I swear I've had that mentality before, and it never works out. I also like that quote over there, which is a little jab at Christopher Columbus. I should also note that this is the third appearance of SpongeBob's brain this season. Looks like the writers had brain on the brain. This is a meh episode. Despite all the positives here, there is one fatal flaw. That entire action scene was a lie, and a dirty lie at that, just like in Penny Foolish. In this episode, while SpongeBob is piloting the boat, you see the outside of it multiple times from the front, and yet never do you see any sort of hint that there's a little guy in a little tugboat in front of it. Oh sure, SpongeBob foreshadows earlier on that the thing is taken for maintenance once a year, but that doesn't stop the fact that you don't see any sort of hint at this while it's going on. So it makes the entire action sequence feel very, very cheap at the end. It's not a funny joke, it's not something that had to be in the plot, it's just there and irritating. You can't even say that they had to put in an excuse for SpongeBob not to get his license, because really, there is no reason Mrs. Puff should award SpongeBob his license just for doing one awesome thing with boating. She should just give him a pat on the back and say he's learning, and then they walk off into the sunset. Would that really have been such a bad ending? But nope. Can't have that. Gotta have SpongeBob look like an idiot. Gotta have Mrs. Puff get mad at him. That's the status quo. And we end on a stupid joke. It's not enough to ruin the episode completely, but it's enough that the episode is definitely not fully enjoyable. Maybe if it had been a little bit funnier, it could have gotten away with good, but because its focus is on the story and they have to put that stupid plot point at the end, it's a meh. Episode 103A, Spongicus. Plankton creates a Roman Colosseum to lure in customers. So the best part about this episode is the Roman atmosphere. From the cool design of the lionfish, to the Colosseum itself, to just the way Bikini Bottom embraces the Roman theme. I really like that about this episode, and I think the show has proven that when it wants to go all out with a theme, it really goes there, and it's really cool. However, I think this episode is a case of style over substance. There's not much that actually happens in this episode. Most of it just amounts to SpongeBob and Patrick circling around the arena being chased by a lionfish. Not much actual action occurs, and there's not really much in the way of jokes either. I feel like this was a great and unusual setup that wasn't used to its full potential. There's even a scene at the end that just kinda continues on. Really, they could have ended the episode with Plankton running away from the lionfish, but instead they cut back to the Krusty Krab, and Mr. Krabs and Patrick thank SpongeBob for saving them, and then they have a good laugh that just goes on, and I get that it's supposed to be a joke, but it just feels like it drags for too long. My point is, they had some time that they could have put into making this episode a little bit more epic or a little bit more funny, and they really just didn't use it. To me, this episode just screams meh. It's got a pretty interesting theme, but everything else about the episode is pretty forgettable. Episode 103B, Suction Cup Symphony. Squidward tries to write a symphony while SpongeBob loudly pretends to Dr. Patrick. This is another episode where I really like the concept more than I like the execution. I like the idea of Squidward accidentally writing SpongeBob and Patrick into his symphony, but the way it actually happens is a little bit repetitive. We see a lot of the same stuff we saw from earlier in the episode just come back. And it's mostly Patrick screaming and kind of annoying noises like that, when I think it'd be a lot more clever if the noises that SpongeBob and Patrick made actually ended up coming together with the music to provide some pretty awesome vocals. I mean, it does in story, but for us watching, it's still mostly Patrick screaming and SpongeBob making weird sound effects. This episode has some, shall I say, more adult jokes in it, like the fact that Patrick mentions that his job doesn't offer him health care. Like, what kid is going to understand what on earth that means? And of course, there's the rubber duck joke, which is just there. I don't find it funny, and I don't find it offensive. It's just there. What's ironic about this episode is that SpongeBob makes a much better doctor than Patrick did in Suds, and a much better doctor than Patrick will make in a few episodes. There's also a part in here where Patrick is enjoying a magazine in the waiting room, despite the fact that that's what made Patrick hate the doctor in Suds. But I guess I can't expect the writers to remember that. I'm gonna go ahead and give this one a meh. While I'm not a big fan of a lot of things in this episode, I can't really say I hate them. I kinda like how SpongeBob is trying to cover up for what he thinks is Squidward's farts at the beginning of the episode, and I kind of like some of Squidward's brainstorming process. And I also like the fact that the writers threw Squidward a bone and actually had the people love the concert in the end, and love the composer, not just SpongeBob and Patrick. Episode 104A, Not Normal. SpongeBob becomes normal. My favorite part of the episode is how SpongeBob's voice is so nice and calm when he's normal. I kinda wish that that was just his voice all the time, because compared to his usual high-pitched post-movie self, it's a lot easier on the ears. I quite like this episode a lot. Much like Patrick's Smart Pants, it's an episode that deconstructs a main part of a character, and then shows us what the opposite of that would be like. I love all the jokes relating to SpongeBob being normal compared to how weird he is. I like SpongeBob insulting Squidward because Squidward is too strange. I even like how once SpongeBob has become fully normal, the Krabby Patties just become paper. My personal theory on that is that while SpongeBob still had some weirdness left in him, that's what made the magic of the printer actually work and print real Krabby Patties, whereas once he became full normal, it was just ink and paper. I also like how SpongeBob fails twice to become weird again. He tries on his own and then he tries with Patrick, and neither of them work. I like it when characters fail at something and then have to overcome it in an unusual or different way. It's a good episode. It's a really great plot that fits so well with SpongeBob, with a bunch of amusing things and little jokes thrown in there as well. Episode 104B. Gone. SpongeBob wakes up to find there is no one else in Bikini Bottom. So this has kind of become one of those stock plots. I saw it in a Twilight Zone episode, I saw it in a Jimmy Neutron episode. I've seen this before, where a character either believes to be or is actually the only person left alive. It's definitely a neat concept with a lot of story possibilities, but I'm not a big fan of where SpongeBob takes it. The first part is just SpongeBob imitating everyone, and while I admit some of the imitations are amusing and funny, the sequence goes on a little bit long, and then the second half of the episode is SpongeBob falling in love with a car, a la To Love a Patty, and then believing that the car has it out for him. And then there's that ending. I know a lot of people hate this ending, and trust me, I'm not trying to defend it, but it doesn't bother me as much as most people. I still find it stupid and pretty horrible that they would do this to their friend, but I don't think the episode was great up to that point either. I find the whole SpongeBob falling in love with a car thing to be worse. Not only is it weird to have SpongeBob fall in love with a car, I mean, he literally wakes up in bed with it, but it's so similar to Love a Patty. It feels like we're going through the same plot points again. When you have this sort of blank check of a plot device, such as having all the other characters leave, focusing on something that you've already done in a previous episode is pretty weak. This is another episode that's wasted potential, but the concept isn't even original to SpongeBob anyway. So there isn't really many positives in the episode at all. It's a ScumBob episode, and I'm pretty sure no one would care if this episode was just gone. Episode 105B, Fine. Episode 105A, The Splinter. SpongeBob gets a splinter. If you don't know, I've already spoken about this episode before. It was one of the first SpongeBob episodes I ever ranted on. In fact, the only reason I talked about it was because my fans voted and decided that was the worst episode of SpongeBob at the time. It was not fun to watch then, and it's not fun to watch now. I hate splinters. More than the average person. When I was a child, I walked barefoot on a deck and ended up with over 30 splinters in my feet. There were so many splinters that I had to go to the hospital and be put in a straitjacket while the doctors pulled them out. There were so many, in fact, that they couldn't get all of them out. The splinters stayed in my feet, and I had to soak them in hot water for the next few weeks just to get them out. I hate splinters. A good episode would take something as horrifying as splinters and make them funny, using comedy to take away my fear of them and take away the power that they have over me. This is not a good episode. But you know what? Since I've already talked about it, let me review this episode without talking about the Splinter itself. So this episode is basically split into 4 parts. The introduction, the part with Squidward, the part with Patrick, and the conclusion. The introduction is actually not too bad. Shows typical SpongeBob getting ready for work, but of course they put a little twist on how he makes Krabby Patties. Then the episode does a decent job of faking you out by putting a bunch of swords on the ground and having SpongeBob only narrowly escape them. With impossible physics, but hey, it's a cartoon, so whatever. After the thing happens, SpongeBob tries to do his normal workday without using that hand. If that were the entire episode, I think it'd be okay. Instead of focusing on you-know-what, if they just focused on SpongeBob trying to get through the day without being able to use one of his hands, maybe the episode could have been funny. But no, we get Squidward's part. And Squidward's part is incredibly frustrating to watch. Squidward lies to SpongeBob repeatedly, and SpongeBob gets all sad. We've seen this before in episodes like Graveyard Shift, and there it was entertaining because you knew Squidward's story was over the top and ridiculous. It also builds to something. In this episode, what Squidward says actually doesn't build to anything. Yes, it makes SpongeBob afraid to tell Mr. Krabs about his Splinter, but they could have accomplished that in a few seconds. No, this has to drag it on with Squidward tormenting SpongeBob over it, SpongeBob begging and pleading with Squidward. It's just dragged on for so long and is kind of a downer. There's nothing funny or entertaining about it. But of course, that's topped by Patrick's part. Patrick once again tries to play doctor. We've seen this before in Suds. And it's not so much what he does that bothers me, because Patrick's given SpongeBob bad advice. It's more of his attitude throughout the entire thing. He's got such a stupid, smug look on his face. This isn't Patrick trying to help out a buddy. This isn't Patrick genuinely concerned about SpongeBob. This is Patrick pretending to have power over SpongeBob and abusing the fake power. And then in the conclusion, we get SpongeBob trying to hide you-know-what through a sequence of events that is very similar to how SpongeBob was hiding the painting in Wet Painters. So even without talking about how painful and disgusting the titular Splinter is, the episode is frustrating, dull, stupid, and mean-spirited through and through. Even if it didn't have a Splinter in it, it would still be a
ScumBob
episode. Here's the thing about this episode, though. At the very least, it elicits a strong emotion from me. And in that respect, I do give the people behind the show a little bit of credit for making something so disgusting and uncomfortable it sticks in people's minds. As a piece of art meant to evoke the emotion of pain in me, it works very well. The problem is the fact that this is a SpongeBob episode. We're not talking about some experimental thing on Adult Swim. We're not talking about something on Comedy Central that's really dark humor. This is SpongeBob. Though of course there were some instances of gross out in the first few seasons, never would they ever go this far with such a painful, uncomfortable concept. Episode 105B, Slide Whistle Stooges. SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward annoy people with slide whistles. That's it. That is this entire episode. That's what all the jokes revolve around. That's what the plot is. Slide whistles. To be fair, the first few slide whistle jokes are actually kind of funny, but it's around the point where SpongeBob and Patrick chase Squidward out of his house because they're annoying him so much with slide whistles that you realize this is all this episode has to offer, and slide whistles get annoying really fast. Also, apparently they make Squidward just lose it. Like, he goes completely insane here to the point where he's assaulting babies, stealing trucks, and just generally being a really horrible person, all the while laughing it up. He's really snapped here. And it's actually a little bit scary, especially with SpongeBob and Patrick enabling him. Also, I find SpongeBob and Patrick slide whistling at the hospital to be really, really stupid. Like, come on, it's a hospital. It's not funny, it's just kinda rude. This is the stuff that Peter Griffin would do. I think this episode would have been great as a 4-minute episode back in season 5. I think that the slide whistle jokes are unusual and interesting, and to have a whole short based around them would have been clever. But this goes on for way too long. It's a
ScumBob
episode. Episode 106A, A Life in the Day. SpongeBob and Patrick become thrill seekers. So this is one of Larry's biggest appearances ever. Really, the only episode he had a bigger role was SpongeGuard on duty. And after 6 seasons, it's about time you start using these tertiary characters a little bit more. I don't think I'm ever gonna get the phrase "living like Larry" out of my head. And there's a few good jokes, like SpongeBob riding on the mechanical seahorse. The stunts themselves are alright. I wouldn't say they're fantastically animated. I wouldn't say there's some amazing action going on here, but they look pretty cool, especially Larry's at the beginning. But this plot isn't great. Most of the episode is just SpongeBob or Patrick doing stunts without much of a narrative to go along with it. Also, this episode is very similar to pre-hibernation week. At least in that episode, there was more of a narrative of SpongeBob trying to escape Sandy than this one, which is just they see Larry do a cool stunt, Patrick does stunts, drags SpongeBob along, and then SpongeBob does a stunt and drags Patrick along. That's the entirety of the plot. It's a meh episode. I guess I'd be more forgiving if the episode was a little bit more funny, or if the stunts were a little bit more epic and bigger and used more animation, but as it stands, there's nothing very impressive about this episode. Episode 106B, Sun Bleached. SpongeBob accidentally spends too much time in a tanning bed and gets sun bleached. Oh boy, this episode. So my favorite part is the character designs. I like the design of Craig Mamelton, I like how Patrick looks when he's tanned, and I even like the design for SpongeBob once he's been sun bleached. Or, I guess technically tanning bed bleached. Overall, this episode is pretty forgettable and bland. There's very few jokes, and even fewer that are actually funny, and the plot itself is pretty weak. As if that weren't bad enough on its own, there's a lot of unfortunate implications that come with this episode. This episode is very pro-tanning, especially in tanning beds. SpongeBob and Patrick are mocked for using sunscreen and are told that they have to get tan to get into this party, and decide to make a tanning bed out of Patrick's home to get tan. First of all, no kid should worry about getting tan, period. That's stupid. Second of all, tanning beds are really bad for you. They are cancer machines. In this episode, SpongeBob gets sun bleached when he stays in the tanning bed for too long, but in real life, you'll get cancer. The episode tries to say that it's anti-tanning in the very last few seconds, but that message is not very clear. I don't think the writers were intending to do anything with this, but it does give off a very unfortunate vibe. And that's not where it ends either. When you look at this episode, it's basically characters judging other characters based on their skin tone. And not just their skin tone, but how brown versus how white they are. It definitely brings to mind images of racism. Again, I don't think that's what the writers were going for, but I can't not see it. However, I'm not going to take that into account when giving the rating for this episode. SpongeBob and Patrick promoting tanning, on the other hand, is something that will affect it because it's really key to this episode and something I just can't get over. But even aside from those unfortunate implications, there's problems with the episode. Like the fact that they decide to do a Family Guy-style cutaway gag with an old man drinking soda. And I'm not talking about a split-second live-action scene like they usually do. No, this goes on, and is very in your face. I'm sure some people find this funny, but I just don't. Also, Patrick's kind of annoying in this episode, especially in how they set up SpongeBob going into the tanning bed. You know something's gonna happen and Patrick's not gonna get SpongeBob out. It's incredibly predictable what's about to happen. They spend too much time setting it up. I think the episode is a ScumBob episode. Also, in this episode, Squidward believes in ghosts again. This show cannot make up its mind. 107A, Giant Squidward. SpongeBob and Patrick turn Squidward into a giant. This thing is like rehash the episode. SpongeBob and Patrick are doing good deeds that end up hurting Squidward, like in Good Neighbors. Squidward has to help the townspeople of Bikini Bottom because they feel he owes it to them, just like in The Sponge Who Could Fly. Characters' sizes are changed, and Patrick even thinks of turning a device upside down to make it reverse its effects. Just like in Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 4. I like the part where Squidward and Gary are talking for a second. It seems like they're having a conversation about how annoying SpongeBob and Patrick are. But everything else in this episode is just annoying. Everything is so one-sided against Squidward. From the beginning when Patrick eats his kelp garden for no reason, to the fact that SpongeBob and Patrick make him a giant and actively portray him as a monster, to the Bikini Bottomites all hating him for incredibly stupid reasons. Squidward doesn't get any sort of payback to SpongeBob and Patrick or the Bikini Bottomites or anyone. It's so one-sided that it's not funny. If Squidward had been acting like a monster before before he was turned into a giant, then maybe it would be funny to have everyone just assume he is a monster. But all he's doing is trying to garden. And let's talk about how SpongeBob and Patrick act in the episode. Only in the last minute or so do they actually realize they've ruined Squidward's life. The rest of the time they're running around, giggling, acting all happy. It's annoying to see our characters so blind to something horrible that they've done. And in episodes like these, SpongeBob and Patrick are pretty much indistinguishable from each other. It's like they're one two-headed idiot. The only difference is that Patrick is slightly stupider and the show likes to put a little bit more of the blame on him for the horrible actions done. How lame is it that you have a garden spray be the thing that activates the magic in the episode? This wasn't a case of mundane made awesome like the pencil and Frankendoodle. This just kinda seems like lazy writing. Inconsistent too, because in the beginning, the kelp grow doesn't actually grow the kelp. It just makes it more healthy. The plot is so weak as well. Hardly anything happens. SpongeBob and Patrick grow Squidward, townspeople get mad at him, Squidward's sad because his life is ruined. That's pretty much the entirety of the episode. You could get away with plots that simple if the thing is gonna be funny, but this isn't funny. It's clearly a ScumBob episode. Episode 107B, No Nose Nose. Patrick gets a nose. In general, I like this episode. It's not the funniest, but I think it's a very solid plot with a few good gags to back it up. Like how Patrick's plastic surgeon has taken the hypocritical oath, or how Patrick gets a rocket launcher just out of nowhere. What I like about the story is that although Patrick is acting like a jerk, the show knows it. Mr. Krabs even states that he is turning into a jerk. Patrick's actions are not treated as in the right, they are treated as in the wrong. And the characters are actively fighting against it. This is in sharp contrast to a lot of other episodes where Patrick acts like a jerk and then no one calls him on it. Patrick's jerkiness in this episode makes him the antagonist. And it's a fun change. Even if this episode doesn't make a lot of sense in the greater scheme of SpongeBob, like how there have been episodes where Patrick has been able to pick his nose, or a hole that appears where his nose would be, but I can accept it because I think it's an all-around enjoyable episode. Far from the best, far from the most interesting or the most funny, but I think it's a good watch from start to finish and very easily rewatchable. Episode 108A, Patty Caper. When the secret ingredient to the Krabby Patty formula goes missing, SpongeBob must catch the culprit. Much like Spy Buddies, this episode is kind of a genre parody. Everything's set up like a typical mystery, with suspects and theories on how they could do it. And I think it's actually executed pretty well, up until the last part of it. I especially like all of SpongeBob's stories on how he thinks people could have done it. I think they're quite imaginative and interesting, much like in Blackened Sponge. But it all just falls apart in the ending. First of all, yes, I believe that Mr. Krabs would steal the secret ingredient. That's in line with his character, that all works out fine and good. But the fact that he's so harsh on SpongeBob when he knows he's setting him up to fail is that of a complete monster. Is there any particular reason he has to tell SpongeBob that he'll be fired if he doesn't get the secret ingredient back safely? What's the point if he knows SpongeBob isn't going to be able to do it? And again, at the ending, why would he call the police on SpongeBob? Why would he frame SpongeBob? Why wouldn't he just say, oh well, maybe it just got lost and it'll turn up at some point? And then the fact that at the end he's just literally holding the bottle? If it was funny, maybe I could accept it as a plot point, but it's not funny, it's just really stupid. In an episode that has mostly been filled with story and not many jokes, to have a major plot point be what is actively a very lame gag of Mr. Krabs revealing himself is a big letdown. Overall, I give it a meh. Because there's a lot of enjoyable parts to this episode, like how Plankton has figured out every ingredient but the secret ingredient and has been methodically, alphabetically trying out ingredients to try and figure out the secret one. That's clever and cool to see. But that ending, man, it's just so stupid. Oh, and one more thing. During the beginning, when Mr. Krabs' siren goes off, when everything's flashing red, the background fish that are in the restaurant turn semi-transparent for a few frames. I have no idea how this could have possibly happened, and although it's very small, it seems very off. 108B, Plankton's regular. Plankton gets a customer to the envy of Mr. Krabs. My favorite part was Mr. Krabs trying to steal Plankton's formula. I think that is a very nice role reversal, and I wish that were what this episode was about. I thought by far the most interesting thing here would be Mr. Krabs having to try and make Chum to compete with Plankton. The stuff with SpongeBob trying to get Nat to eat a Krabby Patty is really just kind of more awkward than funny, and I usually like those kind of setups where where a character has to try and convince another character of something through repeated schemes. However, the story of Plankton getting a regular customer and throwing it in Krabs' face is not really a bad one. Parts of this are very enjoyable, and I even like how the ending is foreshadowed with Nat saying that the Krusty Krab's chum is the second most disgusting thing he's ever eaten, and the fact that he lives in a trailer, implying that he's not very wealthy. As far as the ending goes, I'm a little bit split down the middle on this. On the one hand, I think it kind of makes sense that Karen would be doing this, and I feel like the episode needed some sort of twist at the end, but on the other hand, I really don't think it would have been the worst thing in the world to have Plankton have actually earned something for once. After seeing how happy he was just having one customer, it does feel a little bit cheap to have that yanked away from him. And the way Nat is unceremoniously carried off is kind of uncomfortable. You really gotta wonder what kind of life Nat leads when he says he doesn't have any friends and he's willing to poison himself for money. This episode is very meh. It doesn't really have that many jokes, and the plot itself is alright, but not particularly strong. At the very least, though, it certainly holds my attention and doesn't get boring. Episode 109A, Boating Buddies. Squidward must attend boating school with SpongeBob. My favorite part of this is the brief interaction between Squidward and Mrs. Puff, and that's about it. That's about the only positive I can say about this episode. The premise of putting Squidward in boating school with SpongeBob has a lot of potential. I mean, aside from boat smarts, this is pretty much the only time Squidward's interacted with Mrs. Puff. But this episode makes SpongeBob be really just beyond creepy. The way he looks at Squidward, the way he puts his fingers on Squidward, it's unsettling. There's been a lot of times in the show when SpongeBob obsesses over Squidward. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's not. But this just goes beyond everything before it. This is just really horrifying and character damaging. I just can't believe how creeped out I am at SpongeBob in this episode. It's one thing to have an episode that's not funny, but to have an episode that just really goes against what your main character is about and just makes him very dislikable, that's pretty bad. Oh, and the episode has very little substance in it as well. There's one scene where Squidward just draws on the chalkboard and restates what happened in the very beginning of the episode. And there's another extended scene where SpongeBob, Squidward, and Mrs. Puff are in a car that goes out of control, and they wind up in some kind of science lab where they get shrunk and almost eaten and they wind up down the drain. It just goes on and it has nothing to do with anything. And it's not mentioned again. It's definitely a big-lipped alligator moment. But more than that, this episode is a ScumBob episode. Episode 109B, Krabby Kronicle. When Mr. Krabs starts a newspaper, SpongeBob is forced to print lies. My favorite part is the joke about how Chum is people, because in real life, Chum is actually ground up fish. Unfortunately, that seems to be one of the very, very few jokes in the episode. This is one of those episodes I would chalk up to being too soap opera-y. And what I mean by that is that this episode takes itself way too seriously. There's a part where Plankton is kicked out of his restaurant, and he's like, "Why did this happen to me? Who could have done this?" And it's played completely straight. There's not any sort of comedic touch to any of SpongeBob's reporting. It's all just a very straightforward morality tale about spreading lies. And it's so predictable. Of course Mr. Krabs is gonna make SpongeBob print lies. Of course the lies are actually hurting people. Of course SpongeBob's last story is going to be about Mr. Krabs. Duh! Every little step of this is painfully obvious as to what's going to come next. And a large bulk of it is just SpongeBob reporting on people, which I'd be fine with if they made it funny, but they didn't. I just can't get any enjoyment value at all out of this episode. And that's not even getting into the weird ending where Mr. Krabs suddenly starts counterfeiting money. Like, I don't get it. They make Mr. Krabs awful the entire episode, he gets his comeuppance, but no, he definitely has to be happy in the end. And for an episode so keen about dropping morals of telling lies, it doesn't seem to mention anything about how counterfeiting is wrong. I have to give it a ScumBob. And not only is it predictable and not funny, I just don't buy into the drama. Yeah, okay, Mrs. Puff had her boating school closed down, but who cares? It'll be back in the next episode no matter what. The end of the episode doesn't even really resolve anything. It says that Mr. Krabs is printing lies, but the nature of lies is that they tend to stick even once the truth has come out. So I just can't get invested in the story, even if it wasn't predictable. Episode 110A, The Slumber Party. Mr. Krabs sends SpongeBob to spy on Pearl's sleepover. I'm sorry, guys. This is the first episode all season that I think has actually been really funny. Sure, I've liked episodes before this, but I think this one is the first one that has enough comedy that it could actually rival most of the episodes pre-movie. There's a lot of good jokes here. And I think what particularly makes it work is how SpongeBob is snarky in the face of Mr. Krabs treating him horribly. He doesn't just sit there and take it like he does in a lot of episodes. He still does what Mr. Krabs says, but he's making these comments all along the way. And a big part of the comedy in this episode is the irony. Mr. Krabs comes and wrecks SpongeBob's house when he says that that's what teenage boys do. Mr. Krabs says there's no boys allowed at Pearl's Slumber Party while he's constantly trying to smuggle a boy in. Said boy, SpongeBob, ends up destroying the house. Krabs may not be born with an innate sense of irony, but I sure am. Another thing that I really like about this episode is that it's one of those cartoon character has to do wacky schemes to try and get in somewhere plots, much like in No Weenies Allowed. Heck, they even pulled pretty much the same gag in this episode as in that one with SpongeBob's doppelganger. I like these kind of plots, and I think they fit particularly well for a gag-based show like SpongeBob. Every single one of his attempts has something funny to it, and I won't spoil the punchline of any of these. I think this is my favorite of Pearl's appearances in seasons 1 through 6. I think that this is the episode where she's been best used, even better than in Bossy Boots. I think she acts like a teenage girl, and the dichotomy between her and Mr. Krabs' struggle comes from a very real place. And Mr. Krabs isn't really a jerk for not trusting his teenage daughter. That's something that any dad would hesitate to do. The fact that he's a cheapskate hardly even comes into play. He's just overprotective of his stuff. And of course, in the end, Krabs gets his just desserts. It's not just a good episode, it's a great episode. And that's not even getting into some minor things like how Mr. Krabs asks SpongeBob if he knows anything at all about girls. Spoiler alert, he really doesn't. Also, the episode starts with Pearl screeching, "Unacceptable!" Hilarious in hindsight, indeed. Episode 110B, Grooming Gary. SpongeBob primps Gary for a pet show he doesn't want to be a part of. So this episode is pretty much just the Great Snail Race, but instead of SpongeBob training Gary for a race, it's SpongeBob foofing Gary up for a pet show. Same thing where Gary tries to tell SpongeBob he doesn't want to be a part of it, but SpongeBob keeps pushing him and making him do what SpongeBob wants to do until things come to a head and SpongeBob realizes his mistake. It's pretty much the same plot. But I will say this episode does it better, so I can't be too mad at that. It's better in the sense that it makes SpongeBob look less like a jerk here. He's not torturing Gary, he's just trying to make him look more presentable, and of course he's going a little bit too far with it, but he comes off here as a lot more ignorant than just plain old selfish. This episode does have problems, though. The main one just being that it's dull. It's just not that interesting. In addition to being a plot we've already kind of seen before, there's not many jokes, there's not many twists or turns, and the whole pet show thing has been done on a lot of other shows. I kind of like Gary's speech, but only kind of. Unfortunately, this episode is just boring enough that I have to give it a ScumBob. It's definitely on the cusp of being a meh episode, but it's just so boring. Episode 111, SpongeBob SquarePants versus the Big One. SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward must surf their way home after getting stranded. And this episode actually has two subplots, where Mr. Krabs is trapped above Davy Jones' locker in a confrontation with the Flying Dutchman, and Sandy is trapped on a desert island left to fend for herself. There's a lot of things I like about this special. I like the tone, it definitely achieves the surfer dude vibe. I really like the Davy Jones joke. I think it's just absolutely fantastic, and I love how he is just hamming it up and having the time of his life on screen. That's what really sells the joke. And I like that there is indeed subplots in this episode to balance out the runtime of the main story. But unfortunately, it's just not enough. This episode has a lot of dull moments. It's not very funny, and although the plot can be awesome at times, at other times it just kinda doesn't do much. which really stinks because I think the animation is great. I think the setup is awesome, but it just needed a little bit more of either comedy or story. Basically, I put it in the same camp as Have You Seen the Snail or The Sponge Who Could Fly. I feel like all three of these episodes have a lot of good things going for them, but just need a little bit more for me to fully enjoy them. I can tell that the people behind SpongeBob were really trying here because they came so close to telling a solid story. But sadly, even with the subplot, it just can't hold the running time. There's other issues too, like this episode implies that Squidward's never met Sandy and that Mr. Krabs has never met the Flying Dutchman. So apparently Scaredy Pants just isn't a thing anymore. Actually, if the Flying Dutchman doesn't know who Mr. Krabs is, how does he know that he dated his aunt in high school? Why am I even questioning this? Oh, and from the people that decided to have David Bowie star in a musical episode that he doesn't sing in, and had Alton Brown in an episode that has nothing to do with food, comes Johnny Depp playing a character that hardly gets any lines. Was he paid by the line or something? This really baffles me. You get a big name star like Johnny Depp and you have him say like one phrase over and over again and then maybe like 10 other lines in the entire thing. I mean, come on, what a waste. It's a meh episode. I enjoy quite a bit of this, but unfortunately not the whole thing. At the end of the day, a lot of it is just SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward sitting around waiting for something to happen, and that doesn't make for compelling television. Episode 112A, Porous Pockets. When SpongeBob suddenly becomes wealthy, he becomes a snob, or a sponge snob, if you will. So the thing I like most about this episode is the design of SpongeBob's new mansion. There's a very basic structural problem with this episode that just prevents it from being anything of quality immediately. First, the episode is spent with SpongeBob and Patrick and the sick clam. Then they go and try to play volleyball with the pearl they get, and end up talking to the appraisal guy, who for some reason gives them a lot of money for what they think is just a volleyball. He seemed like a pretty sleazy guy. I don't understand why he didn't just scam them out of the pearl for like $10. I'm sure they would have taken it. But anyway, then the episode is spent with SpongeBob and Patrick looking at stuff to buy. And it's not until the last 4 minutes-ish that we actually get to what is actually the main plot of the episode. Apparently the money goes to SpongeBob's head and he becomes a snob. So most of this episode is just about SpongeBob having money and spending money, which isn't much of a plot in and of itself, but then it just suddenly abruptly switches to, here's another plot about how a character has too much money or power and abuses it and then loses it. That plot in and of itself is something we've seen before on the show in episodes like Rule of Dumb, but the fact that that plot only has a few minutes to unfold severely cripples any chance it had at being good. There's one scene where SpongeBob is giving people free money because he has too much of it. The next time we see him, he's gone full-on snob transformation, where he's just a complete jerk to Patrick. And needless to say, in this mess of a plot, there isn't really much time or effort put into any sort of jokes. It's a ScumBob episode. It's badly structured, cliche, and not funny in the slightest. Episode 112B, Choir Boys. SpongeBob follows Squidward to choir practice.
ScumBob, ScumBob, ScumBob.
I really hate this episode, guys. So much about this bothered me. Where do I even start with this one? I have an idea. How about we start with the stupid throat-clearing gag? This gag happens a few times in this episode, and it basically amounts to that for like a minute. It is Family Guy levels of overly long gag. It's the type of thing where they expect it to go on so long that you actually find it funny, but you don't ever actually find it funny. It is one of the most obnoxious running gags. Like, if it happened once, it'd be annoying, but the fact that it happens 3 times is just infuriating. Oh, and if that weren't annoying enough for you, you get SpongeBob singing in a really obnoxious manner. There's other obnoxious things too, like Squidward's arm after he gets stung is really grotesquely pimpled, and there's a big pulsating vein over all of the pimples. Ugh. And there's some really weird implied symbolism that SpongeBob is some kind of sponge Jesus here. And another overly long gag where Squidward sprays that stupid breath spray thing in his mouth. And the overly long gags that permeate this thing isn't even the most frustrating part. Do you see that quote there? What a lucky break. Now I have a captive audience. SpongeBob says that after digging a hole intentionally to stop Squidward, who is on his bicycle, and then flies off into jellyfish fields where he is trapped by jellyfish. And SpongeBob says that freaking line. Do you know what that line means? That line means that SpongeBob is very much aware that the jellyfish have pinned down Squidward and are torturing him by stinging him, but he doesn't care. SpongeBob wants to sing his stupid song, and he doesn't care who gets hurt along the way. That line right there just totally ruins the shtick for me. At least in Good Neighbors, you could say, oh, well, yes, SpongeBob was harming Squidward, but at least he thought he was being a good neighbor. He was just being really ignorant. Here, they don't even have that excuse. They don't even bother. SpongeBob knows he's torturing Squidward, and he doesn't care. The entire thing with this episode is that SpongeBob wants to sing a song for Squidward, but Squidward doesn't want to hear it because SpongeBob's annoying, and because he's on his way to a choir practice. I don't think Squidward was even being overly mean here. I think Squid totally has a right to not want to listen to SpongeBob's annoying song. He deserves to have SpongeBob follow him around, get him pinned down and stung by jellyfish, and then have SpongeBob eventually take his spot in the men's choir, because he didn't want to sit and listen to his stalker sing a song. The way SpongeBob is just laying there at the beginning of this episode, and the way he just talks to Squidward and sees Squidward, he sets his sights on him like, yeah, I'm gonna stalk you through the rest of this episode. I know it. Yeah, Patrick's out of town. I have nothing better to do. You better appease me, Squidward. This episode kind of plays out like a Looney Tunes cartoon, where a character is trying to do something and the other character constantly foils him. If this had been Bugs Bunny torturing Yosemite Sam with his singing, that's funny, mostly because Yosemite Sam wants to kill Bugs Bunny. Squidward just wants to get to choir practice. This type of plot just doesn't work if Squidward doesn't do something so horrible to deserve being stalked. Not that anyone deserves to be stalked, but you know what I mean, it's a cartoon. SpongeBob's character feels just utterly destroyed. He's not naive, he's not ignorant, he's not just a well-meaning idiot. He is just intentionally harming people to serve his own purposes. He's evil in this episode. And worse than that, he just feels like a writer's favorite at this point. It just feels like they write his character so that he is perfect and can do no harm and has basically transformed into Sponge Jesus at this episode. Meanwhile, Squidward is apparently the devil who deserves to be tortured for every little move he makes. It's a horrible plot that really horribly destroys SpongeBob's character. It's not funny in the least and is just anti-humor, and I have a burning hatred for this episode. 113A. Krusty Krushers. Mr. Krabs tricks SpongeBob and Patrick into wrestling two tough guys. And of course, all the while, SpongeBob and Patrick think it's just pretend. So the first important thing to note here is that the My Leg gag is back. Finally, they actually brought it back, and in a context that makes a lot of sense. Also, Reg from No Weenies Allowed makes a cameo in the line waiting to fight the tough guys. But references aside, this entire episode is very simple. Nearly all of it takes place inside the ring. And the two tough guys barely even speak, and the jokes are pretty much just a bunch of physical gags about hurting SpongeBob and Patrick, even though they're not actually being hurt. But, as I've said, simplicity can work in the show's favor, and I definitely enjoy this episode. It's not particularly laugh-out-loud funny, but it is certainly entertainingly silly. Just all the wacky things that the wrestler dudes do to SpongeBob and Patrick is amusing, and they keep a nice variety to it. And of course, there's a decent amount of wrestling jokes, like the whole sleeper hold thing. Also, I have to give this episode major props for using foreshadowing as a joke. When you do that, you mislead the audience into thinking that Patrick using his butt workout machine was just a silly gag, when in reality, it is actually a major plot point that comes up again later on. The audience isn't expecting it to be a plot point, so it ends up being surprising when it comes back later, even though I find it a little bit weird that Patrick's actually working out. The episode also avoids two major missteps. First of all, Mr. Krabs is particularly heartless here by having SpongeBob and Patrick go in this ring for him where he very well knows they could get severely hurt. But because the entire episode has SpongeBob and Patrick just giggling away, not getting hurt at all, and Mr. Krabs gets his comeuppance at the end, it's really not that bothersome. Yes, if you look at it, Mr. Krabs is being really horrible to SpongeBob and Patrick, and potentially putting their lives at risk, but the episode plays it in a very silly way, so you don't really think about it that much. And also, the episode pulls the SpongeBob and Patrick being super ignorant of the world around them shtick, which can get on my nerves very easily, but in this episode, it really just doesn't bother me at all. And I think it's just because of how over-the-top violent and crazy the wrestler guys are compared to the really innocent, silly, and childish behavior of SpongeBob and Patrick. And because, for whatever reason, they're not actually getting hurt, it's kind of understandable why they'd still believe it's just play fighting. SpongeBob's ability to take a hit comes back from the bully, I guess, and Patrick is just tough enough and stupid enough not to feel pain, maybe? Or maybe it's just the magic of SpongeBob and Patrick. Either way, this is a good episode. 113B, the card. Patrick's mistreatment of a trading card drives SpongeBob mad. This episode is about trading cards, particularly how some collectors can be really fanatical about having things in mint condition. But this episode is a complete train wreck. Let's start with the trading card aspect. Do they do anything to show that anyone on the writing staff ever actually played, collected, or traded with baseball cards, Pokemon cards, or anything similar to it? Nope. And yet, this episode is about making fun of people who love cards and don't want to see them get ruined. I don't have a problem with shows making fun of any of my hobbies or tendencies, but in this example, it feels like they're laughing at collectors rather than laughing with them. They don't throw in any bonus jokes for us to get. It's more like, see how these people who collect trading cards are? See how insane and fanatical they are? Let's laugh at them. I'm not offended by this, but I do find it frustrating. Trading cards provide a wealth of humor. There's a lot of silly things about them and the people that collect them. But instead, they decide to make one specific joke, which brings me to the humor. It is repetitive. The only joke you get to see in this episode is that Patrick uses the trading card for stupid purposes, and then SpongeBob gets really upset about it. Well, almost every joke. For whatever reason, they decide to begin this episode with SpongeBob withdrawing money at the bank to buy these trading cards. It feels completely out of place and has very little to do with the rest of the episode. We don't need to know where SpongeBob got the money from. And the jokes there aren't funny either. And then there's Patrick, who is completely oblivious to his friend's pain for most of the episode. His behavior would be annoying no matter what, but the fact that they throw in that quote over there that implies that Patrick is doing these horrible things on purpose just makes it even worse. Oh, and another irritating thing about this episode is the fact that there is a very easy solution to SpongeBob's problem. They're called trading cards. SpongeBob has a mountain of them. Patrick only wants the card. He doesn't care what's on it. SpongeBob, trade with Patrick. Give him a useless card. That's all he wants. I know it would defeat the purpose of the episode, but the writers should not have made a story where there's such a simple solution that none of the characters ever think of. Needless to say, it's a ScumBob episode from all sides. The episode does end with SpongeBob getting the card. In fact, quite a few copies of the card. But no, it doesn't make up for this episode's lack of comedy, terrible plot, total misunderstanding about anything related to trading cards, and just all-around frustration. If you want to see an actually good episode about trading cards, watch Adventure Time's Card Wars. That episode makes fun of trading cards, but also celebrates them and makes a lot of jokes that people who are actually in that fandom would understand. Also, it manages to pull off having a character act really jerky much better than in this episode. 114A. Dear Vikings, SpongeBob and Squidward get shanghaied by Vikings. So apparently, SpongeBob doesn't know what a Viking is. The guy who celebrates Leif Erikson Day doesn't know what a Viking is. The guy who wears a Viking hat in his own opening theme doesn't know what a Viking is. It's not even like him not knowing what a Viking is really that crucial to the story. I don't understand why it's even... what? Anyway, speaking of story, this episode is really lame. Okay, so Vikings kidnap SpongeBob and Squidward, and then they just kinda talk on the boat for a little while about their culture, and then they hit an iceberg, but strangely no Titanic reference. Then SpongeBob plugs up the leak, and episode over. He claims it's a Viking-sized adventure, but if that was the case, Vikings must be tiny. Which I guess makes sense if they're the size of SpongeBob. So, yeah, it's not so much that the plot is dumb, it's just that it's very bare bones. And what plot there is seems strikingly similar to another episode, so much so that the title of that episode actually fits in the description of this episode. To Shanghai is to force someone to join your crew. How about the comedy? Well, I'll have to say, Squidward is funny in this episode. His snarky comments to Mr. Krabs are pretty funny, but the rest of the humor comes from saying that Vikings did a bunch of weird, ridiculous stuff that they obviously didn't do. In real life, anyway. I could kind of understand this episode a little bit more if it was actually trying to teach kids about what actual Vikings were like, but that's clearly not what they were going for. This thing was actually nominated for an Emmy, and it didn't win. For very good reason. This episode is a
ScumBob.
Most of the jokes aren't funny, the plot is really bizarre and just doesn't go anywhere. I'm fine with an abrupt ending, but there's just no meat in the middle of it either. But I will say, it's nowhere near the worst of this season. I can at least sit through this one. I don't really get any enjoyment, aside from Squidward, but I can sit through it. Also, how is Squidward state registered to do anything? Are there states under the sea? Episode 114B. Ditchin. SpongeBob cuts boating school. My favorite part of the episode is the ending. I really like the way it all played out. It definitely was not what I was expecting. And it makes a lot of logical sense considering it is Mrs. Puff, and she does seem to almost always end up in jail. And I like her subtle comment about how it's because she skipped jury duty. I also like the opening, which features SpongeBob watching Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy. Yeah, they don't have a lot to do in this episode, but it's always cool to see them show up, and hey, at least they're more relevant here than they were in Nightlight. The bulk of this thing is just SpongeBob running around doing different activities and getting distracted while trying to make his way back to boating school. But because they have so many different set pieces, they don't really have enough time to focus on each of them. He goes to the book signing, gets ice cream, plays badminton, winds up at the Hug Festival, gets stuck in the tar pits, and because of that, there's not really so much time for jokes. But I do have to say, it does make sense within the story why all these things are happening, and though it's not very funny, it's at least not boring. And the joke about the gummy fish in particular stands out as being pretty funny. It's one of those SpongeBob jokes that's really weird and has no basis in reality. I mean, we eat Sour Patch Kids, right? But it's still funny nonetheless. It's not super memorable, it's not super interesting, but it's at least mildly entertaining with a few good jokes. Consider it on the upper side of meh. 115A. Grandpappy the Pirate. Mr. Krabs turns the Krusty Krab into a fake pirate ship to fool his grandfather. I'm actually surprised the show remembered that Mr. Krabs has a pirate motif. In this episode, we get to see more of Mr. Krabs' backstory in that at one point he was actually a pirate and actually had a ship and everything. Though how it all fits in with his backstory and timeline and being in the war and going to school with Plankton is very, very confusing. This episode is just plain fun. The plot is just incredibly solid. The jokes it does tell, like Pearl being mistaken for a sea monster, are really funny. You ever notice how when Mr. Krabs episodes don't focus on him being super insanely greedy, they actually come out really well. He actually makes a pretty likable, if not kinda gruff, protagonist. Gee, it's almost like his love of money has become incredibly overused and boring. Anyway, I really don't have much else to say about this episode other than the fact that it's just enjoyable. It's fun, it's clever, it's interesting, and you're really rooting for Mr. Krabs. It's a good episode and proof that when the writers actually do something different with a character that hasn't been done a million times before, they can tell an interesting and different story. Also, is $2 for a burger actually pricey? 115B. Cephalopod Lodge. After getting Squidward kicked out of his lodge, SpongeBob and Patrick try to make him a new one. Yet again, they use the concept of a secret lodge, and yet again, it is wasted potential. This episode would have been a million times more interesting if we had actually seen Squidward interacting with the cephalopods. But no, we get a rehash of Choir Boys, Good Neighbors, and a few other episodes rolled up into one terrible package. Though this one isn't nearly as frustrating as Choir Boys. Mostly for the fact that SpongeBob actually realizes that he made Squidward sad and even apologizes for it. However, he's still unable to take responsibility for his actions happens when he and Patrick go back to the lodge and say it wasn't Squid's fault, because Patrick says to SpongeBob, "Oh no, it wasn't your fault, buddy," and SpongeBob says the same back to him. Is it such a hard concept to grasp that audiences do not like it when your protagonist causes a lot of harm to a guy who only wanted to be happy in this episode, and then refuses to take responsibility for his actions? Every time there's an episode like this, I go through and say, all Squidward wanted to do was X, but literally, in this episode, all he wanted to do was go to this lodge. He's smiling. That is what sets SpongeBob off and makes him stalk Squidward to this lodge and get him kicked out. Just because Squidward was smiling. He didn't do a single thing to SpongeBob in this episode. Didn't say one even mildly rude thing to SpongeBob before SpongeBob ruined his life yet again. I should mention that the part with the live-action sock is alright. I didn't think it was comedy gold or anything, but I think they did a nice job blending the sock with the animation while still making it look like a crummy effect, which I think was what they were going for. And if this episode had just been about trying to get Squidward back into the lodge, then fine, that'd be one thing. But SpongeBob and Patrick insist on trying to make up a new club for Squidward to join, which of course involves stinging him with jellyfish. No joke, Patrick literally holds Squidward down and stings him with a jellyfish. We've seen this before. This was the entire premise of jellyfishing, and I actually like that episode. And as I mentioned, it happens in Choir Boys. It's a ScumBob episode, and I really have no idea how they keep making this same mistake over and over again. And you know what? They do it again! And it's the very next episode! Episode 116A, Squid's Visit. SpongeBob redecorates his house and traps Squidward inside. My favorite part was in the very beginning where Mr. Krabs was trying to socialize with Squidward, but Squidward was of course shutting him down. It was funny, made sense, and actually fits with the theme of the episode. Hey, you guys remember the episode Just One Bite, where SpongeBob kept pestering Squidward to try and eat the Krabby Patty, and then after Squidward tries it, SpongeBob leaves him alone, but Squidward actually loves it and obsesses over trying to get one while hiding it from SpongeBob? Or how about Idiot Box, where at the end of the episode, Squidward finds out that he actually does want to play in the box and use his imagination? Or Snowball Effect, same thing but with a snowball fight. That's how I wish this episode went down. I wish it was about SpongeBob pestering Squidward to come to his house, and then when Squidward finally does, he finds he actually enjoys it, but tries to keep it from SpongeBob. It wouldn't have been the most original plot in the world, but it is definitely a formula that works for SpongeBob. This episode is self-aware in all the wrong ways. It actively acknowledges that SpongeBob is some sort of really creepy reality warper that can do whatever he wants. And Squidward is just his depressed plaything that goes literally insane. The way Squid goes nuts is not your usual character runs around and yells a lot and acts really crazy, which has been seen a lot on this show. No, he gives a really disturbed face, shrinks into the black background, and then has a disturbing tea party with his vacuum cleaner while his eye is twitching. It's not like it's parodying episodes where SpongeBob does a lot of really creepy things. It's just acknowledging our main character is a horrible person who treats his neighbor like a little toy. I guess I give the episode credit for not treating SpongeBob like the hero of the story, but even still, it's clearly a ScumBob. And you have to love the fact that Squidward apparently has never been to SpongeBob's house, or called him on the telephone. It's a small thing, but when all they had to do was say, "Hey Squidward, you haven't been over my house in a long time," or "Hey Squidward, you've never been over for a cordial visit." It's stupid that this problem even exists. 116B. To Squarepants or not to? Squarepants. When SpongeBob gets new pants, he thinks he's become a different person. Okay, so weirdly enough, this episode has two titles. Depending on where you watch it, sometimes it's called To Squarepants or Not To, sometimes it's called To Squarepants or Not to Squarepants. This isn't like a TV Guide misprint or something. Literally, there exist two different title cards for this. I have no idea why. Also, this episode was hyped up as a special, which is ironic considering special is not the word I would use to describe this episode. In fact, I've actually read a SpongeBob comic in a Nick magazine once about SpongeBob getting his pants mixed up at the dry cleaner and ending up with big round ones. This episode is also kind of similar to Missing Identity in that SpongeBob thinks his entire persona needs to change just because he's lost something. Most of this episode is just kinda dull. It's not really funny and it's not really compelling. SpongeBob gets new pants. okay. The only thing really bad about this episode, though, is Patrick. He has once again put on his really annoying face. I get that they want to use him to jumpstart the plot and to get SpongeBob to think that because he changed his pants, he's a different person now, but there was a way to do it without making Patrick this annoying. He literally sits on the phone with SpongeBob going, and then later we get 2 separate scenes of Patrick not recognizing SpongeBob, but it's certainly not his worst appearance. There is something I really like about this episode, though. SpongeBob and Squidward bonding. When SpongeBob thinks he's become a new person or no one will recognize him or whatever, he decides to follow Squidward around and just copy him. At first, this annoys Squidward like you'd expect it to, but then SpongeBob actually starts becoming a good protege at being lazy. I like this because it's really not very often that we actually get to see SpongeBob and Squidward legitimately bonding. And crazily enough, it actually doesn't feel out of character for Squidward. Why couldn't the episode have just been about that? I mean, it really doesn't even have anything to do with SpongeBob's round pants. He could have chose to invent himself any other time. It's a nice little moment that really saves this thing from teetering on the edge of ScumBob. It's a meh episode. 117A, Shuffleboarding. SpongeBob and Patrick impersonate Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy after getting them injured. So, after getting cameos in both The Card and Ditchin, this is the real Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episode of the season. And it's the first meh Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episode I've reviewed. In the beginning of this episode, there's a lot of slapstick with the murmuring, and I feel it just goes on for way too long, and I don't know, it just feels a little bit off. I can see how there might be humor in knocking down elderly people with a boomerang, but I don't feel like they pulled it off. Also, SpongeBob becoming a vigilante is something we've seen before in Hall Monitor, and the shtick of throwing everyone in jail for really petty crimes is something that just doesn't feel original or interesting. The episode is very forgettable, but let me go through the upside and why I think it's not a ScumBob. First of all, Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy are in it. They don't have huge roles, but they are there, and as I've said before, they're very likable characters that we don't get to see often. Also, the fact that they beat the shuffleboarding competition off-screen is brilliant, in my opinion. And look, I know a lot of people are mad at that. They don't like the fact that the episode was named after something it really doesn't have anything to do with at all. But here's the way I see it. First of all, watching SpongeBob and Patrick shuffleboarding probably wouldn't have been very interesting anyway. And secondly, I just find it funny. A lot of comedy comes from misdirection, making the audience think one thing's gonna happen and then doing something else. SpongeBob can rarely surprise me anymore because in most episodes the characters are so set in stone, I know exactly how they're going to act and it's not funny, surprising, or interesting. The jokes on SpongeBob can get kinda predictable. And I think the joke works because at first you think SpongeBob is shocked that Patrick is talking about beating up elderly people with a shuffleboarding stick, which is kind of funny in and of itself, but then SpongeBob just drops this bomb, oh yeah, we did that off screen, and we got first place. However, I do have to say the episode does feel a little bit unfocused, especially because they do talk of a shuffleboarding competition that doesn't happen. It's definitely not as jarring as Mermaid Man showing up at the end of Nightlight, but because the episode spends so much time getting Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy into the hospital, then setting up the shuffleboarding contest, by the time they get to the actual plot of SpongeBob and Patrick throwing people in the clink, there's not much time left for it to unfold. But back to things I like. I also like the fight between SpongeBob and Patrick and Man Ray. It's nothing amazing, but it's a cool little action scene that brings back one of the more awesome recurring characters. And I like Man Ray's little romance with this elderly woman he apparently went to prom with. So I hope you understand how I could rate this meh. Episode 117B, Professor Squidward. Squidward impersonates Squilliam to teach at a college that SpongeBob and Patrick attend. For some reason. I get that it was a New Year's resolution of theirs to go and take a music class, but that's not really how college works. At least not such an esteemed academy that wants the musical prodigy Squilliam to go there. So this is yet another episode where SpongeBob and Patrick annoy Squidward. But you know what they actually did right this time? They made Squidward do something wrong to deserve it. So it's definitely not as bad as Choir Boys, but what do SpongeBob and Patrick have to do with this episode at all? Why are they here? When Squidward is acting like this, you know what I want to see? I want to see Squidward get caught in his own web of lies because of his own hubris. Not SpongeBob and Patrick teleport in out of the blue and behave once again like a singular two-headed annoying entity. It's a
ScumBob.
And it really ticks me off. One little nice thing I can say about the episode is that there's this little flute piece that sounds like either a different part of or a variation on one of the songs they usually use. voice. You know, the one that goes doot doo doo doot. This version is a lot higher pitched and uses what I'm guessing is the flute. It sounds nice, and it's a nice little variation on a usual tune. Aside from that, though, everything about this episode is just dumb and frustrating. And at this point, it's a tie game with both cephalopods having 2 points. 118A. Pet or Pests. SpongeBob must find homes for newborn worms. The plot of this episode is so cliche. I've seen it in a ton of sitcoms. And the episode isn't funny. It's not even trying. There's this one joke where SpongeBob rings Mrs. Puff's doorbell for a very long time for no reason. Why does he ring the doorbell even though she's there? Why? Other than to be annoying. SpongeBob, from his perspective, is not trying to be annoying. That's not what his character is. He doesn't go around annoying people intentionally. He's just over-enthusiastic. But even someone who's over-enthusiastic, why would he hold the doorbell like that? It's not like the doorbell let out a sound that amused him or anything. No, he just had to ring the doorbell because that's what the stupid, overly long gag called for him to do. In this season, SpongeBob has become a character who has zero motivation for anything he ever does. There's not much else to say aside from the fact that this episode is dry and done to death. Well, there is the fact that apparently Larry was about to eat puppies. Or maybe the people that make this show forgot that worms equal dogs in this universe. And the ending comes out of nowhere. Okay, so suddenly these things are valuable because a garbage man says so? And of course, Mr. Krabs has to make money off of the scheme. He's not even a part of this episode until the very end. Why does he have to profit from this? It's easily,
ScumBob.
You know an episode is messed up when you can cut large chunks out of it without losing anything plot-wise or comedy-wise. Episode 118B, Komputer Overload. Plankton builds robots to steal the Krabby Patty formula. What I find weird about this title is that usually replacing C's with K's is Krabs' whole deal, right? Krusty Krab and all that. I think the K is supposed to stand for Karen, but yeah, it's a little weird that it's named that. Why am I talking so much about the title? Well, because I don't have much else to say about the episode. It's good. I like how snarky Karen is. I like how Karen and Plankton react to each other. I like that Karen actually leaves Plankton and then comes back and he actually apologizes. It's rare that you get a somewhat genuine moment like that in SpongeBob. I like the design of the robots, and I like Plankton's plan of pretty much just marching straight into the Krusty Krab with this thing. The humor is good as well. Karen gets some pretty good digs at Plankton, and that's about it. It's a solid episode. 119A, Gullible Pants. When SpongeBob is put in charge of the Krusty Krab, Squidward tells him lies to mess with him. This episode is pretty dull. It really isn't funny. It uses some elements from previous episodes, and the plot doesn't feel like a complete story. It just feels like a thing that happened. We've seen Squidward mess with SpongeBob before. It was great in Graveyard Shift, and also terrible in the Splinter. SpongeBob wrecking the Krusty Krab doesn't really lead to much. It just happens. The episode was just so bland and had nothing going for it, I had a hard time coming up with what the picture would be for this thing. And I also had a hard time deciding whether it would be meh or ScumBob. It was a close one, but I decided that it's just barely a ScumBob episode. I don't hate it with a burning passion, but I definitely don't like it, and there isn't really anything to redeem it. I found myself daydreaming while watching this thing. That's just how boring it is. 119B, Overbooked. When SpongeBob's friends all need him on the same night, he has to run back and forth to keep everyone happy. So this plot is brilliant. I'm surprised they hadn't used it before on SpongeBob. It makes total sense why SpongeBob would want to please everyone all at once and not want to let anyone down. The guy's a pushover. He finds it hard to say no. This plot makes so much sense for him. And for once this season, he actually has a motivation for his actions. When he acts silly and weird here, it's great because we know that he's not doing it to be weird. He's doing it because he's trying his best to make everyone happy. It's a noble plight that we can all root for. The episode is light on jokes, but the situation itself is so farcical and silly that it keeps a grin on my face the entire time. This episode kinda reminds me of a better version of The Best Day Ever. It's a good episode. I should also mention something about that cake. How do I feel about it? Well, the same way I feel about the adult joke in Suction Cup Symphony, in that I'm pretty neutral to it. I don't think kids will understand exactly what scabies are, so I don't really think it's that bad, but at the same time, I don't really find it particularly funny. It's worth noting that this is the only time all season that Sandy plays a major role. Sure, she has cameos, she gets a teeny tiny subplot in SpongeBob vs. the Big One, and she's one of the people that gets upset with Patrick's nose, but this is the only time she appears for a large portion of the episode. In a show that has only 7 main characters, you would think they would use one of them more. Episode 120A, No Hat for Pat. Patrick gets a job at the Krusty Krab as a sideshow performer. Ugh, this episode. You know something? I think this episode is actually really good. Let me pitch it to you. So, there's Patrick Star. He's super lazy, he's never accomplished anything in his life, and one day he wants a hat. Not just any hat, the hat that SpongeBob is wearing for work. And he doesn't want the hat just because it looks good, he wants the hat because it's a status symbol. SpongeBob's not trying to act snobby or better than Patrick, but by simply having the hat and having a job to go to, he makes Patrick feel inferior just by comparison. So, Patrick decides to be proactive and actually go out and get a job at the Krusty Krab. He works really hard by standing outside and holding one of those arrows that points to the restaurant. He screws up a bit in some pretty funny ways, but eventually earns his hat, which subsequently makes him fall over. And how does Patrick react? Does he act like he's better than SpongeBob? Does he put on a smug face and get up on his high horse? No. Despite continuously falling down, he continues to work. And when Mr. Krabs finds out that people like watching Patrick fall down, he turns Patrick into a sideshow act, making poor Patrick into a mockery, calling him the falling fool. Despite this, and despite being laughed at, Patrick still does his job. He still continuously flops on his face for the entertainment of others, as long as it lets him keep the hat. Eventually, though, the audience grows bored of the same thing over and over. As audiences eventually build up a tolerance to freaks, they want something bigger, better, and more horrific. Mr. Krabs starts upping the ante by having Patrick fall from higher and higher, even causing poor Patrick to get a bloody nose in a way that's not comedic at all. It goes so far that SpongeBob is even willing to stand up to Mr. Krabs because he does not want his friend to continuously harm himself this way. But Patrick begs SpongeBob not to tell Mr. Krabs to stop. Patrick needs that status symbol. He loves it. He works so hard for it. Mr. Krabs creates a big high dive for Patrick to jump off of, but he can't do it because he took off his hat, which is the reason that he was falling. After Patrick doesn't take a dive in the way they expected, the audience all runs at Mr. Krabs and takes back their money and strips him down to his underwear. By the way, Mr. Krabs should never have nipples. Patrick then gets fired and is incredibly sad he has to give back the hat. But then SpongeBob offers to share his very own hat with Patrick, symbolically putting them on the same level. I love this episode because it does everything right. Patrick is sympathetic, he's hardworking, and he's not jerky. Mr. Krabs is a villain, and he's portrayed as a villain. He gets his comeuppance, and he's not seen in any sort of sympathetic light. He's a slave driver, an evil ringleader to this terrible circus, and he gets what's coming to him. SpongeBob is actually willing to stand up to Mr. Krabs' bad business practices. Instead of being blissfully ignorant, he decides that he wants to stand up and fight. Heck, I love Squidward's part as well. He gives us that great line, "It's official, I hate everyone," and gets promptly punished for wanting to push Patrick off of the diving board. I feel like this episode would be great to watch as a companion piece to Big Pink Loser. It definitely doesn't feel like a ripoff, but they both explore similar themes. I just honestly couldn't believe how bad I felt for Patrick in this episode. I hated Patrick in his appearance in the Splinter, and the card, and a number of other episodes this season and the previous two. But this episode just makes me like him. A lot. He's a good-natured idiot here. I just wish that the characters could be this interesting and complex in most episodes. And hey, the comedy isn't bad either. There's some good gags with Patrick and the arrow outside, like literally blowing people away or pointing the arrow in the wrong direction so he directs people to the chum bucket. Those first few times that Patrick falls down after getting the hat are really funny, especially Mr. Krabs' reaction. And you know something? I think the fact that I actually laughed at Patrick the first few times he felt down made me feel even worse for his situation later on. I was one of the ones that laughed at him. I was a part of the audience that was egging him on to hurt himself. That's pretty complex for a SpongeBob episode, making me feel guilty for laughing. And I mean that in a good way. I highly doubt everyone else is gonna feel the way I feel about this episode, but gosh darn it, I just feel so strongly that this is a great and interesting story. And in a season that's been pretty bent on destroying characters, it's pretty amazing to see an episode that actually redeems a character in my eyes. I like you too, Patrick. 120B, Toy Store of Doom. SpongeBob and Patrick get locked in a toy store overnight. I can sum this episode up pretty quickly. SpongeBob and Patrick act like loud idiots, they're never in any danger, and nothing is funny. It's a
ScumBob.
Characters getting locked overnight in a location isn't a new idea, and the show does nothing at all to make the idea fresh or interesting. SpongeBob and Patrick are afraid of toys that aren't actually sentient in any way, shape, or form, so it just means nothing. In something like The Inmates of Summer, SpongeBob and Patrick were also really ignorant and stupid and loud, but at least there they were in some sort of legitimate danger. And in Wormy, at least they had a legitimate reason to believe that the butterfly could be dangerous, plus that episode was actually funny. This thing just isn't. Episode 121A, Sandcastles in the Sand. SpongeBob and Patrick start a war using sand. Much like in The Two Faces of Squidward, this episode starts off deceptively bad. SpongeBob and Patrick are pretty annoying and loud, which kinda made me afraid that this is gonna be another one of those episodes. But luckily enough, little less than a third of the way into the episode, things turn around. It's basically just the same structure that Battle of Bikini Bottom and heck, even Snowball Effect fit into. SpongeBob and Patrick are having a war with each other, using something incredibly silly. This time, it's sand. Heck, this episode even ends with SpongeBob giving a big cheesy speech, just like in Battle of Bikini Bottom. But you know what? I enjoy this type of story, so I don't really mind that this kind of thing is being somewhat repeated. The action is great and exciting, the animation is fantastic, they even use computer generation in a few places, and it doesn't show, except strangely for Patrick's rock, that looks very CG. And it's overall just a fun episode. Once again, I feel the need to say that it's definitely not super funny, though it'll get a few laughs out of you, but it's entertaining and kept a smile on my face. And much like in Overbooked, just the silliness of the situation they're in and how serious they're taking things is kind of like a big joke on its own. It's a good episode. There's not much else to say, except for the fact that apparently the word frisbee is copyrighted, and they make fun of that. Big time. 121B, Shell-Shocked. After breaking Gary's shell, SpongeBob has to find him a new one. The majority of this episode is focused on telling one joke over and over again. The joke is that SpongeBob breaks shells. Because telling the same joke over and over again is always hilarious, right, Mr. Slide Whistle? The rest of the episode is just nothingness. There's a cool, funny part with Angry Jack's commercial, but everything else is just pointless. Like, why do we have to see SpongeBob trying to pay back Angry Jack by giving him an eyeball if SpongeBob is gonna have 2 eyeballs again in the next scene? The payment scene means literally nothing if you're not gonna show SpongeBob retaining the damage from it. It's not like SpongeBob's bank account matters anyway. He has money as the plot demands it. And at the end we see him bargaining with Mr. Krabs for working for a year free, which again means nothing to us, the audience. He's practically working for nothing anyway. So why even show it? This episode is just light on everything. It's a light
ScumBob.
Episode 122A, Chum Bucket Supreme. Plankton hires Patrick to create a slogan for the Chum Bucket. I don't really get the title. The Chum Bucket Supreme is a meal combo thing that Plankton invents midway through the episode, but it is an incredibly small part of it. Chum is Fun would have been a much better title and easier to remember this episode by. The episode is good. It's entertaining, it pairs up 2 characters who have hardly ever been seen together before, and continues this season's theme of giving Plankton a little bit of success. The plot isn't brilliant, the comedy isn't amazing, but the jokes they do tell are enjoyable enough, and the plot is decent for SpongeBob. Though I have to say, it is pretty weird to see Patrick working for Mr. Krabs again so soon after No Hat for Pat. I really do love that slogan. It's both incredibly clever and incredibly stupid at the same time, which is what they were going for. It definitely feels like a slogan that could exist in real life. I wonder if the Fry Cook Games took place in the middle of this episode. It would actually make a lot of sense. 122B, Single Cell Anniversary. SpongeBob helps Plankton woo Karen on their anniversary. Part of it seems to be even somewhat of a throwback to Fun, how Plankton doesn't really know what love is and SpongeBob has to teach him. And it didn't entirely feel like a ripoff, it just felt more like exploring similar themes. And of course, the mariachi song is fun, upbeat, and different from a lot of the songs heard on SpongeBob, but in a good way. I kinda wish the formula hadn't been mentioned at all until the very end of this episode. That way it would have made Plankton seem like he actually did care about Karen instead of just getting the formula. And I'd be alright with the plot as is if they put a ton more comedy in it, but it definitely seems like they were trying to lean a little bit more towards the sweeter side of things than the comedic. It's far from bad, but it is a little bit flawed. I consider it meh, but very close to being good. I think had it been just a little bit funnier or even just a little bit more sweet, one way or the other, it could have been a really great episode. 123 to 124. Truth or Square. A TV movie so bad it takes up 2 production numbers. Since I've already talked about this thing a lot, and it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that it's a
ScumBob
episode, how about we do something a little bit different? I'm going to talk about the Patchy segments and the SpongeBob segments separately. I'm going to give one viewing where I only watch the Patchy stuff, and another viewing where I only watch the SpongeBob stuff. As a whole, it totally fails, but maybe, just maybe, the SpongeBob stuff alone without the Patchy stuff could be good enough to bring it up to a meh, or better. Who knows? Let's do Patchy first, though. It's terrible. It's truly terrible. It's as terrible as I've ever said it was, and worse. Bad production values, terrible comedy, terrible plot if you even want to consider it that, and terrible celebrity cameos considering I have no clue who some of these people are, either because they have nothing to do with anything kids would recognize, or they're terribly dated now. And even the celebrities here that kids would recognize and like are unfortunately not given the best of material, if there was a script written at all, which I'm still not sure about. It is one of the worst pieces of television I've ever seen produced. It's sad that it could turn out this bad when the show makes so much money. And when I say so much money, I mean $8 billion annually. That's how much this show brings in, and yet they still decide to shoot around Nickelodeon Studios. They still decide to just get the cheapest, laziest celebrity cameos, most of them not even being in the same room as our main actor. Effects that are bad, but not in any sort of funny way. Editing that is just sloppy at best. Poor camera work. It drives me up a tree when I see student projects from my college look better than this. In my opinion, at least, this is the ultimate middle finger to the audience. This is Nickelodeon saying, yeah, we hardly put money or time or effort into this thing, but sure, we're gonna make you sit through it because we know you want to watch SpongeBob, and we think you'll watch literally anything. So we're going to shove some terrible, terrible, terrible thing right in the middle of SpongeBob just to stretch out the episode to get more commercial breaks and more money from you. I know I say this a lot, but I really don't ever want to see these segments ever again. Obviously, they're ScumBob segments. Now let's see how SpongeBob's side does without this dragging it down. While the episode definitely feels a lot more focused and the pacing feels a lot more tight without the Patchy stuff, the SpongeBob stuff itself is basically split between 2 things. There's the plot, which is incredibly light. I mean, there's no conflict in this thing until 18 minutes in, and the solution is just them bramming their way out of the vents, which is something they could have done at literally any time. Meanwhile, Plankton's trying to steal the formula by walking into the Krusty Krab. Nothing interesting at all. In fact, I forgot about it until it randomly pops up again, midway through this thing and at the end. But worse than the incredibly dull plot is the flashbacks. Apparently, and I say this with air quotes, apparently, this is supposed to be a parody of clip shows, which is nonsense because they don't play with the concept at all. Unless showing montages that are completely boring and clips that are completely out of context and only made to tease something that doesn't actually happen counts as parody. I've said it before and I'll say it again. If they had actually done a clip show with actual clips from previous episodes, and I'm not talking about the clips of Patchy at the beginning and end of this thing, I mean actual funny SpongeBob clips and memorable SpongeBob clips, if they had used those, then this would actually feel special. This would actually feel big and important and just a big celebration of what SpongeBob is and was. But instead, all it is a reminder of how much the show has changed. Even without Patchy, it's a ScumBob episode, and a really pathetic one for an anniversary special. I've heard people argue that, oh, well, when you don't consider it in the context of an anniversary special, it's not so bad. Firstly, yeah, if it was 11 minutes, it wouldn't be so bad. And secondly, you can't take it out of context of it being an anniversary special. The Patchy segments explicitly call it SpongeBob's 10th anniversary special. You cannot separate it from that. The show is reminding you of how big and special and good this thing is supposed to be, while simultaneously being terrible. It's no wonder no one talks about this thing. Nobody wants to see it again. And that's the truth. I wonder what would have happened if I had picked Square. Alright, let's move on. 125A, Pineapple Fever. Squidward gets stuck at SpongeBob's house during a storm. My favorite part was the lightning effects. I think they look cool, very similar to the ones in SpongeBob vs. the Big One. And that's the only good thing I can say about this. It's pretty much Club SpongeBob, except not funny. SpongeBob and Patrick are annoyingly stupid. Squidward is jerky, but not likably jerky. There's a ton of repetition, and the plot just goes nowhere. At the end, the characters randomly turn SpongeBob BC on us. It is a
ScumBob.
The concept of SpongeBob, Squidward, and Patrick being stuck playing games with each other at SpongeBob's house during a storm is one that showed promise. But when all the characters get on your nerves and there's nothing funny about it, it falls completely flat. 125B, Chum Caverns. Plankton discovers an underground cave and uses it to sell his chum. This episode is incredibly similar to Chum Bucket Supreme. Just replace the slogan with these cool caverns and Patrick with these weird cavern monster things. No, seriously, they are very, very similar. Plankton has success, not because of his food, but because of something else going on around his restaurant. Krabs butts in and tries to put a stop to it, and eventually steals what Plankton had that was working for him. While I do wish this episode didn't come so soon after Chum Bucket Supreme, in production order. In airing order, this episode came one day before Chum Bucket Supreme, weirdly enough. I do actually like both stories, and I think there's room for both of them. Chum Bucket Supreme has the advantage of pairing up Patrick with Plankton, while this episode has the advantage of the cool cave motif. And that's what I like the most about it, the way they use the caverns and the digging to show Plankton and Krabs burying each other. It makes for a pretty cool action sequence that's very similar to Dig Dug. Plus, this episode gets a little bit more of that whole Plankton Krabs almost becoming friends again thing, though not in an annoying teasing way. Even if it is light on jokes, the plot is pretty solid, and the whole cavern motif definitely makes it a good episode. Episode 126, The Clash of Triton. King Neptune's attitude clashes with his sons. In the first few seconds of this episode, you hear soap opera music, and it turns out King Neptune is watching a soap opera. I find it to be the perfect metaphor for this stupid soap opera-y episode. This show does not have the capability to explore the differences in philosophy between a father and a son. This show cannot handle that sort of thing, and it should not have even tried, because all we get is incredibly cliched material that, might I add, has little to nothing to do with any character we actually care about. King Neptune as a character really confuses me because of the whole SpongeBob movie versus the show thing, but within this episode, it makes it very clear that this King Neptune is a horrible ruler, father, and god in general, and he turns his son into a complete jerk, which means that this struggle is between a jerk and a jerk. And when I say struggle, I mean, well, not actually anything. There is no struggle. There's no cool action scenes. There's no fighting. There's no adventure. There's nothing. And then, this episode has the gall to try and make us believe that there's a twist ending. Yeah. Guess what? We know from the beginning Neptune wants his son to act like a jerk. The fact that he explicitly locks people up in cages and destroys the city is what Neptune wanted in the first place. It's not a surprise. And the way they shoehorn SpongeBob and Cast into this plot is really dumb. Apparently King Neptune, a god, wants to eat at the Krusty Krab. Why? Is it because he remembers SpongeBob was a good fry cook? Oh, certainly not. There's no explanation given as to why the royal family wants to eat at the Krusty Krab. And apparently, the reason why SpongeBob is responsible for Neptune freaking out about Triton not being there is because SpongeBob had the audacity to ask where Triton was. Why was there a seat labeled for him if Neptune's wife knew he wasn't gonna show up? Who did that? Did SpongeBob just know about the royal family and assume that he was gonna be here and put that down? And that's not even getting into the fact that we don't get to bring Mindy, an awesome character from the movie, back. Instead, they'd rather just introduce this son character who's cliched as heck. Oh, and it takes forever for Neptune to explain his whole backstory with his son. And there's this overly long, annoying sequence where SpongeBob puts his face up to the cage where Triton is kept, while Triton's been shrunk down, so that SpongeBob's face is huge and his breath is stinky, and his face is just drawn in such a grotesque and unappealing way. Is that supposed to be a joke? What is so funny about having SpongeBob's ugly face that close to the camera for that long? It's not like it quickly flashes to it or anything. If it wasn't funny the first second, holding on it isn't gonna make it any funnier. It's a ScumBob episode. And there's not even any comedy here on top of all of the other problems. The last shot is the Bikini Bottomites ready to chase after SpongeBob after their town has been destroyed. What a wonderfully fitting way for this season to end. And that is every single episode of SpongeBob Season 6 reviewed. I'm going to give this season a rating before we go to the stats. Based upon my personal preference as well as what the statistics have to say, this season is a clear-cut
ScumBob
season. I really wish this season didn't exist. It was very bad. So here's the statistics. 12 good episodes, 12 meh episodes, 23 ScumBob episodes. Almost half the season was bad, and only a quarter of it was good. And let me tell you, those good episodes were definitely nowhere near as good as the stuff that came seasons 1 through 5, in general. Also, a lot of the ScumBobs here are definitely some of the worst things I've ever covered on this series. Since we're running low on time, instead of notes, I'm just going to give the 3 big reasons why I think this season was a complete and total downgrade from season 5. First of all, there's the animation mistakes. Now, this isn't a huge deal because it doesn't hinder my enjoyment of the episodes by that much, but even still, it is not something that should be happening at all. When this show brings in so much money, you think they would have given the effort to do some retakes or something. And a little side note on this point, because I consider it to be a mistake in the animation, the fact that everything this season has been turned up to be gross. And I'm not just talking about the Splinter and the toenail scene, I mean, in almost every episode, there's some sort of pulsating vein or hideous blemish or something really just unappealing. It's fine when they do this stuff for a joke or just sometimes, but it's just rampant throughout the entire season. Then there's the lack of jokes, and I'm not talking about a lack of times that I laughed, I mean that there has statistically been not that many jokes compared to other seasons. I don't know if it's because they had less time to work on each episode based upon the larger episode order, or maybe the creative team was just getting burnt out, but it really does seem like there's not so many extra jokes in these episodes. It feels like there's a few main ones and that's it. Older episodes used to be jam-packed with jokes every second. This one has a very low joke per minute ratio. And lastly, the repetition. And this counts for everything from the fact that there's so many episodes about annoying Squidward this season, to the fact that a lot of these plots and set pieces are recycled from older episodes, to the fact that a lot of the jokes that they do actually tell are really repetitive. These 3 things permeated the entire season, from ScumBob episodes all the way up to good episodes. This is just all in all a downright inferior season. And I have to apologize to you guys. Some of these reviews were a little bit repetitive, and some of them harped on the fact that these episodes aren't that funny. If I had an infinite amount of time, I'd go back and rephrase my wording on a lot of these to vary it up, but I can't. And I just want you to know that the only reason I keep repeating myself is because this show keeps repeating itself, and it's because it is very important that the show isn't making me laugh, or even telling that many jokes. It's crucial to the ratings, so I hope you can understand why I had to say it so many times. Alright, on to my bottom 5 for the season. Let's get it out of the way so we can end on a positive note. Number 5 goes to the card. Really, there's a lot of episodes that could have been in this number 5 slot, but something had to go here, so I'm gonna go with the episode that was not just not funny and stupid, but also completely missed the tons of chances they had to tell good jokes. At number 4, Boating Buddies. It's harmful to the characters, a total waste of what could have been a good plot, and just doesn't have any sort of focus whatsoever. Number 3, The Splinter. It completely and utterly misses the point of the show, and is one of Patrick's most obnoxious appearances. Number 2, Truth or Square. If you include the patchy segments, then this thing is an insult. If you don't, then it's still long and pointless. And number 1, Choir Boys. This is actually worse than Truth or Square, because there's a lot of things that are just annoying or bad to sit through, but this really goes out of its way to make our main character just become horrible, on top of all of the repetitious anti-humor gags. This episode isn't just lazy, it is actively damaging to the rest of the series. Of course, as a reviewer, I go into every episode with a fresh mindset and don't have any prejudice against any character, but I guarantee you, if I was just a regular viewer, then this episode would make me never want to watch another new episode of this show ever again. And going back to watch the old episodes of the show would leave just the tiniest bit of terrible aftertaste, because this terrible episode exists within the show. There's a lot of bad stuff this season, so maybe this list will get rearranged at some point. I mean, there's so many options to choose from. Alright, enough negativity. Let's get to the positives of the season. My top 5. Number 5, Sandcastles in the Sand. The only reason this is so low is because it does borrow from a template of other episodes, as well as having a kind of frustrating beginning, and it doesn't have as many jokes as I would have liked. But still, it's a very enjoyable episode. Number 4, Overbooked. This is an example of a plot that just works so well for the show. Number 3, Not Normal. This is a really cool episode. Only SpongeBob could turn being normal into being really weird. Number 2, No Hat for Pat. I already gushed about this one, so moving on. And number 1, The Slumber Party. This is the only episode the entire season that made me laugh a lot from start to finish. None of the rest of the good episodes out there could actually make me laugh this much. And that is really sad. This is a comedy show, and while it's great that episodes like Sandcastles in the Sand can do cool stuff with animation, or Not Normal can do something interesting with the plot, if a season of your comedy show can't get many laughs out of me, then you've just failed on a very basic level. Wow, well that didn't end up being that positive. Maybe season 7 will be better? Anyway, thanks to these folks for donating to me on Patreon. If you'd like to have your name here, please donate in the link below. And once again, a very special thanks to my girlfriend Erin for providing these awesome visuals. And thanks to these websites for helping me out with music, research, and support. Pieguyrulz out.
Epilogue.
Ugh, I can't even believe how bad this season was. Like, people told me it'd be bad, and then it... You guys aren't gonna believe this. Nickelodeon sent me a pie. Sorry about the Splinter? That's really weird. They're not usually this nice. I just,